Hey guys, tonight we sail past the edges of the known world, not with a telescope, not even with a compass, but with a candle, a worn quill, and a medieval map whose accuracy you probably shouldn't bet your life on. The parchment crackles faintly as you unroll it, revealing a world where Africa is shaped like a mitten, Australia doesn't exist, and there's a suspicious squid eyeing your route to Iceland. You follow a crooked coastline that eventually just stops. Then it's dragons. Just dragons. You're now officially in uncharted waters. This wasn't a flaw in medieval cartography. It was the point. When there was nothing else to go on, you filled the page with creatures and clouds and generous swirls. You, dear traveler, have just crossed into the margin of myth. You probably won't survive this, at least not with your sanity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're all listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a sailor with calloused hands and sea salt in your hair, squinting into the mist somewhere west of Ireland. The year is 1372. The wind smells of kelp and old secrets. A creaky cog ship lurches beneath you, its sails sagging with fatigue and superstition. On board, someone swears they saw a floating cathedral. Another claims a whale bigger than your hull just winked at them. You're not sure who to believe, but you're headed toward the edge of the map, literally. The sea grows colder. The stars overhead become strange. One of the crew mutters about High Brazil, the phantom island that appears only once every 7 years. You check the map. It's there, penciled faintly in the margins like a whisper. Just to the south, a scribbled note reads, "Here be tigers." Not tigers, mind you, tigers, possibly sea leopards, possibly angry clouds with faces. This isn't a navigation tool, it's a dreamscape. But medieval people weren't trying to prank you. These maps, mappamundi, were earnest attempts to capture a world too big to hold. They mashed up biblical geography, Roman sources, and a fair bit of sailor gossip. A 14th century English monk named Ranulph Higden created one of the most popular versions. His Polychronicon tried to explain everything: heaven, earth, and where exactly the king of Gog and Magog might be hiding. Historians still argue whether he believed all of it or just thought it made a good story. What's certain is that maps in this era didn't have edges because the earth stopped. They had edges because knowledge stopped. And knowledge had boundaries, usually decorated with lions or centaurs, or a whale wearing a crown. You squint at the horizon again. Still fog. Still sea. Maybe an island? Maybe not. You remember someone in town said that venturing too far west would bring you to the realm of St. Brendan, who once saw demons frying souls on fiery islands. Charming, but the ocean doesn't care. It just keeps rolling. Then comes a sound, not thunder, but the low, wet groan of something massive just beneath the waves. You check the map again. A margin illustration shows a sea serpent in that very spot, coiled like a pasta noodle, nibbling a tiny ship. You laugh nervously. Just ink, you say aloud, but you grip the rail tighter. Interestingly, dragons weren't always there just to frighten. Sometimes they were placeholders. Unknown territory. A signal to readers. Beyond this line, we make no promises. It was a kind of medieval footnote, only scaly. Scholars today debate whether these drawings were ever taken literally by most viewers, or if they were understood as symbolic flourishes. Maybe they said, danger. Maybe they said, we're not liable for what you find out here. And maps weren't the only place you saw monsters. Medieval bestiaries, those glorious illustrated catalogs of real and not-so-real creatures, fed the cartographic imagination. If a giraffe could be described as a camel leopard, why not believe in a fish with wings and antlers? As you drift further west, a gull cries overhead. Or is it something else? You can't be sure anymore. The ship's compass, a rather new addition in Europe, spins uneasily. Someone mutters a prayer. You keep walking the deck, map in hand, eyes flitting between reality and parchment. On the map, you're already somewhere you were never meant to go. The edge of the world, according to one school of thought, wasn't where you fell off. It's where belief had to take over. So you clutch that map like it's a spell book and let your mind wander. Why do some corners have saints riding dolphins? Why does one island look suspiciously like a loaf of bread? And what about that tiny caption near the corner that reads, Terra Incognita, Land Unknown? The map doesn't answer. It only shrugs ornately. Your boots creak on damp wood. Another sailor pukes dramatically over the rail. Someone else recites a psalm. You settle beside a lantern, letting the flame illuminate the curling margins of the map again. Somewhere near the bottom edge, a sea creature you hadn't noticed before seems to smile. You smile back. This is what the edge of medieval geography feels like. Less like an end, more like a dare. A softly drawn line between what is and what might be. And as the wind picks up and the fog curls tighter around your ship, you find yourself wondering, what's on the other side? You're sitting now beside that flickering lantern, and someone on the deck starts humming. A low, slow tune. Something between a lullaby and a dirge. It's oddly fitting. The map in your lap feels more alive than it should. You trace its hand-drawn curves, its uneven coastlines, its seas thick with doodled monsters. And you wonder who first decided the world should look like this. Enter the monk with ink-stained hands. Picture him, hunched over in a cold scriptorium somewhere in 13th century France. Let's call him Brother Etienne. His fingers are blackened with oak gall ink, his eyes strained from candlelight, and his idea of a good time is ruling a straight line with a piece of knotted string. Brother Etienne has never been more than a day's walk from his abbey, but today he's drawing the Caspian Sea. How? With what authority? Well, he has a cracked copy of Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae, a few travel rumors smuggled in by spice merchants, and a deeply questionable Latin translation of Claudius Ptolemy's Geographia. Oh, and let's not forget, a moral obligation to make the map look religiously meaningful, which is why Africa might end up upside down, and the Garden of Eden sits just above India with 4 rivers pouring neatly from it like a decorative fountain. Your monk works slowly. He outlines continents like puzzle pieces he's never actually seen. The parchment wrinkles slightly under his elbow. Calfskin, expensive stuff, smells faintly of old cheese. He dips his quill and carefully dots in a city that might not exist. Then he leans back, yawns, and scratches his tonsured scalp. You're watching him from the candle's edge, invisible but present. He pauses over a corner of the map that hasn't been filled. Here's the rub. He doesn't know what goes there. Should he leave it blank? Risky. Should he copy an earlier map and just fudge it a bit? Probably. Instead, he does what any exhausted monk would do. He draws a beaked fish with wings and writes, "Uncertain region." That's medieval honesty right there. Historians still argue whether map makers like Etienne believed in the creatures they drew. Were they literalists or illustrators with a flair for the dramatic? Some scholars suggest monks viewed maps as theological instruments, less about geography, more about morality. The earth was not a place to measure, but to contemplate. This makes more sense when you remember that in many medieval maps, east is up, not north. Why? Because Eden was thought to be in the east, and maps had to point to hope. So you've got yourself a deeply spiritual map maker, drawing an earth not as it is, but as it should be. Your job, if you were a medieval reader, wasn't to navigate with this map. It was to reflect with it, like a stained glass window, but flatter. And yet, there was pressure. Maps could serve power as well as piety. A monk might be commissioned by a bishop, a noble, or a particularly fussy abbot who wanted Jerusalem front and center. Drawing the wrong city too large, or forgetting to include the lands of a nearby lord, could lead to some very uncomfortable conversations. Why, dear brother Etienne, is Genoa smaller than Amalfi? Are we not friends of the Genoese? The politics of cartography could be surprisingly cutthroat for a field where the tools are mostly ink, parchment, and patience. This is why, over time, some monks developed signature flourishes, swirls here, a lion there, a particularly attractive rendering of the river Ganges. It became a kind of silent competition. Who could make the most respectably inaccurate map? You, watching from the shadows of time, begin to admire Brother Etienne. He's not trying to deceive anyone. He's just doing the best he can with what little the world has told him. Occasionally, a traveler might visit the abbey with tales of saffron fields or gold-hoarding griffins. Etienne nods politely, then adds a small mountain range and maybe a winged sheep or two. And what about scale? What about longitude and latitude? Forget it. Scale is for the next millennium. Etienne measures with instinct and divine inspiration. England is large because the monastery is in England. Jerusalem is in the middle because it has to be. And oceans, well, they mostly exist to frame the continents and carry the fish dragons. You can hear the scratching of the quill, the occasional sneeze, the low chant of another monk reciting psalms nearby. Etienne is nearly done for the day. His map looks full. Not accurate, but full. There are no large gaps, just enough imagination to cover the blank. In the top corner, he writes a phrase in Latin that translates to, "The world is vast and full of marvels." A safe statement, open to interpretation, slightly apologetic. Then he draws a tiny compass rose, even though he's not entirely sure what it does. As you drift back from your invisible perch, the map glows faintly under the flickering light. It's beautiful in its way, not practical, not precise, but honest about what little people knew, and what even less they pretended to know. Back on your ship, the fog presses tighter around your shoulders. You fold the map gently, carefully, reverently. The paper crinkles like old snow. Somewhere in the darkness, a crewmate whispers, "Are we still going the right way?" You nod. "Yes," you say, "as long as we don't fall off the edge." You lean over the railing now, the wood slick with mist, and peer into the dark. The sea yawns beneath you, endless, unknowable, cold, just like the maps. Because here's a strange thing about those old medieval maps. While they had oceans, they didn't really have the sea. Not the way we imagine it. They didn't chart currents or depths. They didn't note whirlpools or trade winds. No, the sea was simply there. A bluish expanse that separated places and held monsters. More boundary than environment. But here's what makes your eyelids droop a little heavier tonight. When the medieval mind looked to the edge of the world, it wasn't just dragons they feared. It was the idea of absence, the unknown. And that's where the phrase comes in, "Here be dragons." Except, plot twist, almost no real medieval maps actually say that. Only one known map, the Hunt Lennox Globe, a tiny copper sphere from around 1510, includes the Latin phrase, hic sunt dracones. That's it. That's your whole here be dragons moment. The rest? Just sea serpents, suspicious mermaids, or lions looking confused in the margins. But even if the phrase didn't flood medieval cartography, the sentiment did. You can imagine it now. A ship nearing the edge of known waters. A lookout calls down from the crow's nest, voice shaky. There's something big out there. What do the sailors think it is? A whale? A kraken? A god? Maybe all three. You see, dragons weren't necessarily evil in the medieval mind. They were metaphors, warnings, symbols of chaos, and sometimes just cool things to draw when the parchment felt too empty. Take the Carta Marina, drawn by Olaus Magnus in the 1530s. It's Nordic, technically post-medieval, but it leans into the dragon aesthetic like no one else. This map is packed with sea monsters, tusked whales, fire-breathing fish, even a land-walking sea cow that looks deeply unhappy with its life choices. None of these creatures are placed randomly. They cluster in the uncharted zones, hugging the coasts of places like Greenland and Iceland, as if to say, you could go here, but maybe don't. And the best part? These monsters weren't invented just for the map. Olaus pulled from sailor testimonies, folklore, and early naturalists who took the phrase first-hand account a little too generously. One poor creature, a giant squid perhaps, was drawn based on descriptions from men who'd only seen its tentacles wash ashore and assumed the rest of it was, well, city-sized. Historians still argue whether these depictions were meant to be literal. Were mapmakers warning sailors about actual sea beasts? Or were they using monsters as stand-ins for, we have no idea what's here? Some scholars even believe monsters were more about filling space, like artistic insulation against the terrifying vacuum of the unknown. But that doesn't mean people didn't believe. Far from it. Imagine being a 14th century sailor. You've never seen a map that showed the Americas. You've been told the sea just sort of ends. Your cousin died after sailing too far west. His ship never returned. The locals say he must have sailed straight into Leviathan's mouth. So when you see a map with a scaled creature curled beside the coastline, tail looped, teeth bared, you don't scoff. You squint. You worry. Because for you, this isn't just cartographic creativity. This is your potential future. One of the most commonly depicted beasts, the aspidocolone, a giant sea turtle so massive that sailors mistake its back for an island. They land on it, build a fire, start cooking their salted fish, and then the island moves. Straight down. Gulp. You laugh a little, imagining the scene. One sailor halfway through roasting a partridge, suddenly slipping into the abyss, yelling, "This is not ideal." The aspidocolone was first mentioned by early Greek and Roman authors, then lovingly adopted by medieval bestiaries. And because bestiaries were one of the monks' favorite sources for truthish content, the Turtle Island became a staple in marginalia. What makes all of this even more charming, and a little sleepy, is that the map margins were never just space for monsters. They were social commentary. If you lived in France, the dragons might be near Scotland. If you lived in Venice, they were in the east. Danger was always elsewhere, on the periphery, on the fringe. The margins became the medieval subconscious, all their worries doodled out in tentacles and wings. Sometimes, those margins included more than monsters. You might spot a man with the head of a dog, a cynocephalus, or a woman with her face in her chest. or someone with feet so large he could use them as an umbrella. These creatures weren't pure fantasy. They were plausible oddities, drawn from second-hand traveler tales and ancient Roman ethnographies of far-off peoples. To the medieval imagination, the world was full of distorted mirrors. The farther you traveled, the weirder things got. You sit back, listening to the waves lap against the hull, and suddenly feel a deep kinship with those medieval mapmakers. Not because you believe in krakens or turtle islands, but because you understand the urge to fill the gaps, to make sense of the blank, and maybe, just maybe, to decorate the unknown with something fabulous. After all, who wants a perfectly accurate map of the world if it means admitting how much of it we still don't understand? You exhale slowly, letting the map in your hand flutter slightly in the sea breeze. In the corner of the page, half faded with age, is a curled sea serpent. Its eyes are almond-shaped and surprisingly gentle. Below it, someone long ago wrote, "Beware, for here swims mystery." A better warning than, "Here be dragons," don't you think? You stretch out your legs now, imagining yourself perched inside the scriptorium of a medieval monastery, hunched over a creaking desk. The candles sputter. The ink smells faintly of iron. Outside, rain patters gently on slate rooftops. And in front of you, unfurled and drying carefully, lies a map not of precise coastlines, but of imagination, worry, and faith. Because here's something they don't teach you in school. Medieval maps weren't just navigational tools. They were spiritual documents, snapshots of a world God designed and humans distorted. And while dragons and sea monsters might grab your eye, what fills the center of those maps is often more revealing than what looms at the edges. Take the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300. It's enormous, over 5 feet tall, drawn on a single calfskin. But what's stranger is its structure. East is at the top, that's right. North isn't up. East is. Why? Because that's where Eden was believed to lie. And you, staring sleepily at the parchment, notice Jerusalem is smack in the center. Not because it's geographically accurate, but because it must be. To the medieval mind, maps had to reflect divine order. They weren't about GPS-level accuracy. They were about showing you where your soul fit into God's landscape. Modern viewers might call this inaccurate. But to the cartographers of the 13th and 14th centuries, accuracy meant something different. It meant moral clarity. You didn't just want to know where Constantinople was. You wanted to know which path led to salvation. Of course, between Jerusalem and Eden, there was, well, chaos. The in-between zones got a little weird. The margins weren't only for dragons and odd humans. They were where the sins of man and the strangeness of nature collided. There you'd find Scythians eating horses, Ethiopians living under the burning sun, and Gog and Magog, the two evil nations from apocalyptic scripture, caged behind an iron wall built by Alexander the Great. Yes, that Alexander. He got around. Some of these figures were lifted directly from the Bible. Others came from Roman geographies. Still others were the equivalent of medieval gossip. A guy told me a guy sailed east and saw people with one enormous foot and no mouth. And somehow, that made it onto parchment, carefully inked in by a monk who had never left his abbey. Historians still argue whether these marginal figures were intended literally, symbolically, or just artistically. Some claim they were theological warnings, visual metaphors for what lies beyond Christendom. Others think they were playful, even satirical, poking fun at travelers' tall tales. But what no one doubts is that they were deeply human. You picture it now. A cartographer hunched over his vellum, smirking slightly as he draws a man with 3 faces. He's probably thinking, let's see if this one makes it past the bishop. And now, your gaze drifts to the rivers that cut through these maps. Have you noticed? They always look vaguely like veins. The Nile snakes downward like a loose shoelace. The Tigris and Euphrates cradle Babylon. And from the top flows the Gihon, one of the 4 rivers of paradise, mentioned in Genesis. Yes, medieval maps often included Eden, and not metaphorically. It's usually drawn at the top, surrounded by a wall of flame or ringed by clouds. Inside, you'll find Adam and Eve, sometimes mid-banishment, with a suspiciously friendly-looking serpent nearby. Apparently, even in Eden, mapmakers couldn't resist adding a creature in the margins. And what separates Eden from the rest of the world? Sometimes a barrier of mountains, sometimes, bizarrely, a desert full of stones that scream if you try to take them. Good luck with that. Here's a fun tidbit to dream about. On the Ebstorf map, a now lost Mappa Mundi destroyed in World War II, the entire world was drawn inside the body of Christ. His head at the top, in the east, his feet at the bottom, west, and his hands cradling the margins. A literal embodiment of divine geography. Imagine curling up to sleep with that image. A world held together, not by tectonic plates, but by holy patience. As you drift further into this parchment-painted world, you begin to see how the margins of these maps weren't warnings, they were invitations. Come see what you don't know, they whisper. Explore the spaces you fear. And so the dragons, the dog-headed men, the kingdoms of gold, they all serve a purpose. Not just to frighten or fill space, but to remind you that the world is big. Bigger than your monastery, bigger than your parish, bigger than your anxiety about getting lost. But here's where things get cozier. Even with all that mystery, medieval maps were also deeply local. They include tiny villages, shrines, bridges, and abbeys that no longer exist. You might even find a note in the margin like, "Here lives Brother Aldred, who makes excellent cheese." Okay, not quite that specific, but not far off. You begin to notice how the known world bleeds gently into the unknown. There's no hard line, just soft curves of coastline, vague mountains, and the occasional note like, "Beyond this lies a land of darkness where no man returns." Comforting. And somewhere on that map, on every map, is you. Not by name, but in spirit. You, the wanderer, the reader, the one brave enough to look past the center and into the dragons. You close your eyes now, picturing yourself tucked into a borderland town near the edge of a map's margin. Perhaps you run an inn, or you gather seaweed, or you draw your own maps, careful not to let the ink blot. Outside your window, a wave crashes, or maybe it's the flap of a dragon's wing. Either way, you're right where you belong. You stir slightly as the fire in your imagined medieval hearth crackles low. The wind murmurs outside your crooked little cottage by the sea, somewhere near the edge of the known world, or at least the part that fits on parchment. Tonight, you're not just a sleepy map reader. You're a resident of the margin, a cartographic native, and your neighborhood? Full of truly strange neighbors. Because medieval maps didn't just show creatures, they cataloged them, like an illustrated bestiary with a travel itinerary. So let's take a sleepy stroll through your local monster directory, starting with the fan favorite, dragons. Not fire-breathing dinosaurs, mind you. These were a little more unpredictable. Sometimes they were giant serpents, twisted like overcooked noodles. Sometimes winged lizards with questionable wingspans. And sometimes, hilariously, they were just very angry-looking snakes. But always, they marked danger. not always because someone saw one, but because someone felt like something must be there. And really, isn't that how most bad Yelp reviews start? One iconic example is the Carta Marina, drawn by Olaus Magnus in 1539. It's technically post-medieval, but the vibes are pure parchment age panic. This map is swimming in monsters. Off the coast of Scandinavia, you'll spot sea serpents coiling around boats like confused noodles. There's a fish so massive it gets mistaken for an island. Sailors land, build a fire, and are promptly flung into the sea when it dives. Whoops. Classic medieval Airbnb fail. And then there's the Kraken's cousin, a giant lobster off the coast of Iceland, claws raised like he's in a very aggressive dance battle. Historians still argue whether Olaus included these monsters to reflect sailors' fears or to spice up his geography homework. But either way, we're grateful. Now, step carefully. You're entering the land of the Blemii. These are men with no heads and faces on their chests. Why? No one knows. Maybe they lost a bet with a wizard. You'll find them hanging around in North Africa on many maps, just chilling like it's normal to have eyeballs where your nipples should be. It's not. Then there's the skyopods, one-legged people with giant feet. Not only do they hop everywhere, but they use their huge single foot as a sunshade, which, honestly, is both stylish and practical. Somewhere between a beach umbrella and a sandal. Medieval SPF 50. The margins are also populated by cynocephaly, dog-headed humans, often shown with swords, sometimes even writing letters. There was genuine debate among scholars about whether they had souls. St. Augustine, the patron saint of let's think this through, pondered it seriously. His conclusion? If they're rational, maybe they're just a weird branch of humanity. Imagine a council vote on whether a beagle counts as a person. What's wild is how these creatures were often included earnestly. The people who drew them weren't trying to write fantasy. They were transcribing what was considered the best available knowledge, layered over centuries of travelers' tales, classical texts, and a sprinkle of speculation. It's the medieval version of copy-pasting from Wikipedia, but the source is a guy who sailed east and swore he saw a unicorn. Speaking of unicorns, they show up too, but rarely in the margins, usually closer to the known world, tucked into forests near real cities. Why? Because people really wanted them to exist. They were symbols of purity and Christ himself. You weren't scared of a unicorn. You were just mildly annoyed that you hadn't seen one yet. Let's not forget the basilisks, griffins, and manticores, beasts stitched together from leftover mythology and genuine zoological confusion. A lion with wings? That's a griffin. A lion with a human face and a tail made of venomous spines? Hello, manticore. A rooster that kills you by looking at you? That's a basilisk, and honestly, same. These beings weren't always just filler art. Some maps marked them with purpose. Here be lions. Here be serpents. Not just decorative, they were warnings, especially near coastlines that led nowhere familiar. You imagine a sailor seeing those words and thinking, maybe we just don't go there. But others argue the opposite, that these beasts were invitations, a way to spark curiosity, to tempt brave explorers. After all, what's more compelling than danger just beyond the border? And yet, there's a surprising tenderness in some depictions. Not every monster is angry or deadly. Some look lonely or goofy. Like the sea pig, a rotund, flippered creature with a snout and a vaguely puzzled expression. You almost want to feed it a carrot. And what's most telling? These monsters usually live far from the map's center. That's not just geography, it's psychology. The further you stray from your safe zone, the stranger the world becomes. the margins mirror our fears and fantasies in equal measure. You're not just drawing creatures, you're drawing your uncertainty. Scholars still debate how much of this was believed versus how much was just tradition. Were scribes pressured to include monsters to meet expectations? Or were they indulging their own curiosities, hiding Easter eggs for future generations to squint at and wonder? You imagine yourself now, aged and ink-stained, slipping a little dragon into an otherwise boring coastline. Just for fun. Just to see if someone notices. A tiny rebellion in red ink. Because here's the secret. Medieval cartographers weren't just clerks. They were part theologian, part artist, part rumor collector. Their maps were mood boards of medieval anxiety and wonder. Every sea serpent was a story. Every dog-headed man, a question mark in fur. And as you settle deeper into your pillows, it starts to make sense. The world isn't flat or round in these maps. It's emotional. Fear at the edges, order at the center, faith holding everything together with a string of uncertain coastlines and shaky ink. You curl inward now, drifting into sleep, your dreams crowded with polite griffins and sunbathing skyopods. Somewhere, a manticore yawns. You're still drifting somewhere near the edge of the world, map parchment rustling softly beside your cheek. The monsters have quieted, settling into their inked outlines, but the sea below them is still vast and suspiciously wavy. Tonight, you're sailing into those undulating blue lines that once made up the known world's terrifying swimming pool, the medieval ocean. If you've ever looked at a medieval map and thought, wow, that sea sure is busy, you're not alone. These maps didn't just include water. They filled it with swirls, lines, bobbing ships, dolphins that look like mustachioed eels, and occasional swimmers who seem oddly calm given the Kraken situation. Medieval oceans weren't just background noise. They were a central character in the drama of existence. They were both pathway and punishment. You could find salvation across the sea, or fall off the edge of the world. High risk, high nautical fashion. Start with the basics. The ocean was terrifying, not just because of storms or drowning, but because people genuinely weren't sure what was out there. Think of the medieval sea as an infinite do not enter sign, but occasionally with a dotted line labeled, but maybe. That's how you end up with Viking raids, crusader voyages, and enthusiastic spice traders showing up 4,000 miles off course, asking for cinnamon and possibly directions. Now, in most mappamundi, those circular medieval world maps, the ocean wraps around the entire known landmass, like a protective moat, or a decorative tablecloth. The edge of the map wasn't always the edge of the world, though. Sometimes it was just the edge of comfort. And in that uncomfortable ring, you'll find all kinds of ocean-related confusion. Take the Mare Oceanum that often bordered these maps. Vast, blue, and completely filled with things that should not be aquatic. Griffins flying above the surf. Mermaids sunning themselves with expressions of mild disdain. A monk in a boat, seemingly unbothered, possibly checking a scroll. And occasionally, sea bishops. Yes, half-human, half-fish ecclesiastical creatures who maybe grant absolution between waves. Historians still argue whether some of these figures were satirical or serious. Were they theological metaphors? Just sailors' drunken misinterpretations of seals? Or did someone genuinely spot a merman and go, that guy looks ordained? Then there's the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the Voyage of St. Brendan, a wildly popular medieval travel tale in which a pious Irish monk and his monk friends sail the Atlantic for 7 years looking for the promised land. Along the way, they encounter talking birds who sing psalms, a crystal column in the sea, and an island that turns out to be a giant sleeping fish. Again. Medieval people were obsessed with accidentally cooking dinner on sea monsters. Brendan's voyage was so popular, it made it onto actual maps, not just as a story, but as a place. Island of St. Brendan shows up on charts well into the 1700s, floating vaguely in the Atlantic like an apologetic ghost. A place no one could confirm, but many insisted existed. You know, like modern internet recipes. That's part of the magic of medieval seas. They weren't just geographical, they were aspirational, full of legends, lost lands, and holy destinations. And that included paradise, literally. See, in some early medieval maps, especially influenced by Christian theology, Eden wasn't just a past location. It was still on Earth, hidden in the east, behind rivers, and perhaps across water, surrounded by flame or guarded by angels with do not enter energy. But it was there, and in some cases, ocean journeys were thought to be one possible way of reaching it, if you could avoid the sea monsters, the whirlpools, and the occasional judgmental merman. Cartographers didn't just illustrate these seas for accuracy, they filled them with narrative. Your map wasn't a tool, it was a storybook. The sea was a dramatic character with moods, calm near the coast, furious near the unknown, and always threatening to swallow the unworthy. Let's talk ships. Tiny, bobbing vessels drawn onto maps like brave little bathtub toys, often out of scale, always full of gusto. These ships weren't just decorative, they marked routes, trade paths, crusader voyages, Viking exploits. You'd see them sailing past Iceland or skirting the edge of Africa, sometimes surrounded by fish, sometimes menaced by tentacles. But some maps went a step further. They included shipwrecks, sinking vessels, floating barrels, hints that not every sea tale had a happy ending. And yet, there's something charming in the way they're drawn, more whimsical than tragic. Like the cartographer wanted to say, this part is dangerous, but also kind of fun if you don't mind getting extremely wet and possibly eaten. And then there's the matter of direction. On many medieval maps, east is at the top, not north. Why? Because east was sacred. That's where Eden was, where the sun rose, where spiritual illumination came from. So naturally, that meant the ocean often wrapped under and around the world rather than beside it. Seas curled in strange directions and coastlines meandered like noodles dropped from a great height. Cartographers weren't wrong. They were prioritizing meaning over mileage. But don't be fooled. Some of these maps, especially later portolan charts, which were used for navigation, were shockingly accurate, angular, practical, and relatively monster-free. But those weren't meant to hang in churches or royal courts. The pretty ones, the ones you would have admired while drifting into your candlelit nap, were symbolic. That's the real joy of medieval seas. They weren't consistent. They didn't have to be. The ocean was different things to different people. A highway for spices, a moat against barbarians, a route to heaven, a sinkhole for heretics. It was infinite possibility, and a huge inky question mark. And honestly, isn't that how sleep feels sometimes? Like sailing into a story you can't quite control, with the occasional sea bishop waving from a distant wave. You pull your blanket tighter now, the sea breeze imaginary but crisp. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint splash of a sea pig diving after a very confused monk. You are, for all intents and purposes, safely adrift. The sea monsters you see on medieval maps aren't just random doodles tossed in by bored scribes. They tell stories about what people feared, and sometimes admired, beyond their shores. As you settle back into your imaginary ship cabin, the candle flickers. casting giant shadows of dragons and strange fish on the wooden walls. It's time to explore those creatures, the real and the imagined, the terrifying and the oddly endearing. The medieval mapmakers had an odd habit of illustrating the oceans, with beasts ranging from the slightly odd-looking to the downright monstrous. Some were traditional dragons, scaly serpents with flickering tongues, curling tails, and teeth sharp enough to snap a galleon in half. Others looked more like oversized sea lions with grins that suggest they know more than they let on. And then there were the hybrids, part fish, part horse, part God knows what. These were the sirens, often depicted as half women, half fish, humming quietly near rocky coasts, ready to lure sailors to their doom. One of the more popular creatures was the aspidocalone, a giant sea turtle or whale so vast it was mistaken for an island. Sailors would land on its back, pitch camp, and light fires, only to be swallowed whole when the creature dived underwater. It's a terrifyingly vivid story, and one that found its way onto many maps as a warning. In some tales, the aspidocalone was a test of a sailor's wisdom and patience. In others, a cosmic joke played by the sea gods. There's also the Scylla and Charybdis dynamic from ancient Greek myth, but beloved and often adapted in medieval lore. Charybdis was a deadly whirlpool, capable of sucking entire ships beneath the waves, while Scylla was a six-headed monster perched on rocky cliffs, snatching sailors with each snap of its jaws. They often appeared in maps as a dual menace lurking near narrow straits, a geographical embodiment of the between a rock and a hard place dilemma. But why did medieval mapmakers go to the trouble of drawing these beasts? Some scholars argue it was practical. Sailors needed to be warned about real dangers like rocky shoals or treacherous currents, so monsters stood in as vivid metaphors. Others think it was more symbolic. These creatures represented the unknown, the chaotic forces beyond human control, a way to frame the mysterious sea in a language everyone could understand. And it wasn't just fear driving these images. Some sea monsters were almost mascots, representing nature's power and the world's untamed beauty. The Leviathan, a biblical sea serpent, wasn't only a monster, it was a symbol of divine might, a reminder of the sea's sacredness and its ultimate obedience to God. To see the Leviathan was to witness the hand of the divine, even in something frightening. Historians still argue whether some sea monsters originated purely from sailors' tales, actual animal sightings, or ancient texts recycled over centuries. For instance, the narwhal tusk was often sold as a unicorn horn, and sightings of giant squids may have inspired the kraken legends. Some sea creatures on maps may have been exaggerated reports of real animals seen under poor lighting or after many pints of ale. One particularly whimsical example is the Merman Pope, a crowned half-man, half-fish figure appearing on some nautical charts, often holding a staff. Was this a playful jab at the church, a cautionary allegory about false prophets, or just a creative flourish? Nobody's quite sure. And then, near the margins of these maps, those mysterious borderlands where dragons lurk, cartographers sometimes included stories written in Latin or the local tongue describing these monsters. The text might warn that the monster's breath can melt iron, or that they sing lullabies to weary sailors, much like your own soft ASMR tonight. Those stories were carefully crafted to provoke a reaction. Stay cautious, respect the sea, and remember that the world is bigger than your own hearth and village. It was an early form of user experience, medieval style. The margins were a playground for imagination. Sometimes mapmakers filled empty spaces with battles between sea monsters, demonstrating that even the monsters had their own dramatic lives. One famous map shows a giant fish with a long neck tangling with a huge sea serpent. You can almost hear the splashing, the angry roars, and the splintering of wooden ships. And of course, the monsters sometimes had surprisingly friendly company. Around these beasts, you might find small drawings of dolphins or whales, which medieval sailors often revered as good omens, guides, or helpers. Dolphins were believed to escort lost ships to safety or to carry souls to heaven. In fact, sailors sometimes left offerings to these good sea creatures, hoping for calm waters ahead. The contrast between terrifying monsters and helpful marine animals reveals the medieval mindset. The ocean was a place of mystery, danger, and unexpected kindness. It was alive, unpredictable, and deeply respected. So, as you lie here, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, imagine the medieval mariner peering nervously over the side of his boat, eyes scanning the dark waves for a glimpse of a friendly dolphin or the flicker of dragon's fire beneath the surface. It's a world where every ripple might hide a story, every shadow a secret. The dragons and monsters on the edges of the map weren't just warnings, they were invitations. Invitations to dream, to imagine, and to respect the vast, unknowable seas that stretched beyond every horizon. As you shift your gaze from the sea monsters to the map's wide margins, you find they're not empty voids, but carefully crafted canvases of stories, humor, and sometimes outright whimsy. These margins weren't just the leftover space after drawing coastlines and rivers. They were a deliberate place for cartographers to share lore, warnings, and even jokes, quietly inviting the reader to explore not just geography, but imagination itself. Imagine holding one of these medieval maps, your finger tracing the thin, twisting rivers, then pausing where the parchment widens into the margins. Here, a tiny band of men in strange hats might be shown chasing a giant rabbit. There might be a group of armored knights wrestling a unicorn, or a playful monk slipping on a banana peel. Okay, maybe not the last one, but some marginalia were genuinely humorous. In fact, the margins of these maps often contained grotesques or drolleries, little fantastical creatures, human-animal hybrids, and scenes that look like they escaped from a dream after too much mead. One common figure is the marginal monkey, a mischievous creature often depicted holding scrolls or teasing noble figures. Historians still argue whether these were merely decorative, subtle critiques of authority, or a way for scribes to amuse themselves during long hours of copying. And it's worth noting that these marginal images weren't always just entertainment. They often carried hidden meanings or warnings. Take the strange wild man, a hairy giant holding a club, who appears near the borders of maps and manuscripts. Sometimes he symbolized untamed nature, lurking beyond the civilized world. Other times, he was a metaphor for human savagery, a reminder of what lies beneath polite society's surface. Medieval thinkers often believed that the edge of the known world was where order dissolved into chaos. So the margins became symbolic borders between the known and unknown, civilization and wilderness, safety and danger. The more fantastical creatures appeared there, the closer you were to the edge of reality itself. One particularly charming example is the blemmy, a headless humanoid whose face sits on its chest, often scribbled in the margins of maps and bestiaries. These bizarre beings stirred both fear and fascination, embodying the strange and unknowable. You might also notice inscriptions near the creatures, snippets of Latin or Old English teasing the reader with riddles or folk wisdom. Sometimes these notes explain the monster's habits, like how the aspidacoloni lures sailors, or how the wild man can only be tamed by kindness. Other times, the scribes just had fun with puns and jokes lost to modern readers. Cartographers were often scholars, monks, or travelers themselves. Their marginalia offer us a glimpse into their personalities: serious, playful, curious, or skeptical. One manuscript shows a tiny mapmaker doodling himself, complete with a quill in hand, chasing a runaway inkpot across the page. This level of self-awareness in such formal documents is oddly comforting. Remember, the maps were practical tools, but they were also works of art and storytelling. The margins allowed artists to break free from strict geographical accuracy and express creativity, humor, and sometimes even social commentary. Interestingly, the margins sometimes included snippets of advice for travelers. Some notes cautioned about strange customs in distant lands, odd weather patterns, or bizarre foods. Medieval Europeans were often curious, but also wary of foreign places, and these marginal annotations helped prepare readers for the weird and wonderful world beyond their village. There's also a tradition called monstrous races, where writers and illustrators described entire peoples thought to live on the fringes of the world. These figures might have dog heads, single feet, or other strange traits. While we might see this as fanciful or even offensive today, medieval readers accepted them as part of the great unknown, a place where the rules of humanity bent and twisted like the sea monsters offshore. Scholars debate how much these creatures represented genuine beliefs versus metaphorical expressions. Were people truly convinced a one-footed giant roamed faraway mountains? Or was it a cautionary tale about outsiders and the limits of knowledge? The answer remains elusive. The margins, then, served multiple roles. They were visual entertainment, allegory, warning, and cultural bridge. They remind us that medieval maps weren't just about direction. They were about navigating a world full of wonder and uncertainty. So as you drift toward sleep, think of these margins not as empty space, but as doorways. Doorways where dragons nap, wild men lurk, and a mapmaker's quirky imagination runs wild. You're invited to explore these shadowy edges, to wonder what it means to chart not just the lands, but the vast landscapes of human curiosity. And if you ever feel the tug of adventure, imagine yourself tracing a finger along the margin, pausing to read a faded inscription about a wild man's kindness or a sea monster's lullaby. These little stories carry the warmth of a storyteller's whisper across centuries. Sleep now, with the comfort that even in the margins, there is life, laughter, and the gentle reminder that the world, both known and unknown, is full of quiet magic. You've now sailed past the sea monsters and peeked into the lively margins. But medieval maps had another curious feature that might make you smile as you drift: the inclusion of real people and real politics in a world otherwise ruled by myth and mystery. These maps didn't just chart landscapes, they mapped power, identity, and the ever-shifting boundaries of kingdoms, empires, and alliances. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a parchment map where a tiny yet meticulously detailed castle crowns a hilltop surrounded by colorful banners fluttering in a breeze you can almost feel. Nearby, a little group of armored knights patrol a border, their spears raised as if ready to fend off an invading army, or maybe just a pesky neighbor. These aren't mere decorations. They are subtle political statements, reminders of who controlled what, and how fragile those claims could be. In a time when the average person never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, maps became powerful tools of identity. Kings and nobles used them to legitimize their territories, showing who ruled where. A map might proudly display a kingdom's borders adorned with heraldic shields, while neighboring lands appeared shadowy and unknown, or worse, filled with monsters. This blending of geography and politics was a way to visualize power. It gave rulers a sense of control, even if their actual reach was patchy and contested. Imagine the cartographer as a court artist and diplomat rolled into one, tasked with pleasing patrons while navigating the political landscape with a quill and parchment. One particularly fascinating feature found on some maps was the mappa mundi, which means map of the world in Latin. The most famous example is the Hereford Mappa Mundi from the late 13th century, a sprawling circular map that places Jerusalem right in the center of the world. Around it swirl biblical scenes, cities, and creatures, mixing fact and faith into a grand visual sermon. What's charming about these maps is how they reflect the medieval worldview, a blend of religious belief, folklore, and the practical realities of the known world. The world wasn't flat in the scientific sense, but rather shaped by spiritual and cultural centers, and maps were as much about telling a story, about God's plan and mankind's place in it, as about navigation. Historians still argue whether these maps were ever meant to be practical travel guides or if they were primarily educational or devotional objects designed to be read like a book rather than used on a voyage. After all, try steering a ship with a giant circular map dominated by monsters and biblical scenes. Good luck with that. The political symbolism on maps also extended to lesser-known regions, where rulers were often depicted with exaggerated features or even as mythical figures themselves. In some cases, foreign lands appeared as mysterious and dangerous places, inhabited by exotic peoples and creatures, reflecting both curiosity and fear. For example, on some medieval European maps, Africa was shown crowned with an array of kings, elephants, and fantastical animals, like the blemmy, heads-on-chest men we met in the margins. These images were as much about the European imagination of the continent as about actual geography. Similarly, Asia was often illustrated with temples, warriors, and bizarre beasts, conveying a distant, almost otherworldly grandeur. The Silk Road and other trade routes sometimes appeared as delicate threads connecting these wonders, hinting at the flow of goods, ideas, and even rumors. Interestingly, maps occasionally included depictions of famous historical figures or saints, linking the landscape with stories of heroism, piety, or conquest. These figures helped cement a cultural memory, reminding viewers of the past while projecting ideals for the future. One quirky example is the inclusion of Alexander the Great on certain maps, portrayed as a giant whose body formed mountain ranges and rivers. This blend of history and myth underscores how medieval cartographers saw geography not just as land, but as living narratives. The inclusion of rulers and symbols on maps also served diplomatic purposes. Sending a beautifully illustrated map to a rival or ally was like sending a message wrapped in art, a gentle assertion of claims, a reminder of alliances, or a subtle warning. For the everyday viewer, these maps might have been windows into a world both familiar and mysterious, where the safety of home was bordered by wild lands and faraway realms ruled by kings, saints, and monsters alike. So as your eyelids grow heavy, picture these medieval maps not just as flat surfaces, but as dynamic stages where politics, faith, and fantasy play out in delicate ink and vibrant color. A world where every castle and king matters, every border is contested, and every corner whispers a story. And remember, the next time you stare at a modern map, that beneath its clean lines and neat labels lies a long history of stories, struggles, and dreams. Stories that began scribbled in those margins, where dragons once danced beside crowned kings. Sleep now, knowing you've traveled not just the known world, but the complicated, beautiful map of human imagination and power. As your mind settles deeper into the cozy twilight of this map-bound world, let's turn to the curious role of the map makers themselves, the medieval cartographers who, with quills poised and inkpots at hand, stitched together geography, myth, and politics into these enchanting parchments. They were part artist, part scholar, part dreamer, and sometimes part trickster. Picture yourself sitting beside one of these artisans in a dimly lit scriptorium, the soft scratch of quills on vellum mingling with the occasional murmur of prayers from the adjoining chapel. The cartographer's world was a mix of rigorous study and imagination, drawing on travelers' tales, ancient texts, church doctrine, and, occasionally, a wild guess or two. Most of these mapmakers were monks or clerics, highly educated in Latin and theology, but with limited first-hand experience of the wider world. Their information came from second-hand accounts, merchant stories, Crusader chronicles, and classical authors like Ptolemy and Pliny. The trick was to blend these sometimes conflicting sources into a coherent image. Historians still argue whether the inaccuracies and bizarre inclusions, like sea monsters or headless men, were genuine beliefs, deliberate warnings, or artistic license. You might imagine a monk chuckling softly as he adds a dragon, knowing full well it's more allegory than zoology. One famous cartographer, Hereford's Richard of Holdingham, reportedly spent years compiling his elaborate Mappa Mundi, weaving together scripture, classical knowledge, and local lore. His map was as much a spiritual guide as a geographical tool. By placing Jerusalem at its center, it reminded viewers of the world's divine order, turning a physical map into a theological statement. You might wonder about the map maker's tools and materials. They used carefully prepared animal skins called vellum, fine brushes, and vibrant pigments made from crushed minerals and plants, ultramarine from lapis lazuli, bright reds from cinnabar. The maps gleamed with color, almost glowing in candlelight, making them prized treasures for wealthy patrons. Another quirky tidbit is that some maps were created in parts, sometimes decades apart, then combined by different artists. This explains why you might find a dragon sketched in a style that feels centuries different from a neighboring cityscape. And then there's the curious case of phantom islands, spots on maps that don't exist but appeared reliably for centuries. One such island, Thule, was thought to be the northernmost edge of the world, a place of eternal ice and mystery. Maps often placed it in the far north, with little notes describing its strange inhabitants or phenomena. Some speculate these were scribes' imaginative guesses or deliberate placeholders. Interestingly, some mapmakers included hidden messages or puzzles within their work, cryptic symbols or clever word plays that only the learned could decipher. These were intellectual games, a kind of medieval Easter egg for fellow scholars, perhaps even a way to assert authorship or wit. There was also competition among cartographers, much like today's race for the best maps or fastest GPS. A monk's reputation could soar if his map impressed a king or pope, and maps often reflected the desires and biases of their patrons. But even as these maps aimed for prestige, they were deeply collaborative. A cartographer might rely on a network of informants, from merchants to sailors to explorers, each adding pieces to the geographic puzzle. However, the distance and language barriers often twisted these stories into myth. The blending of fact and fantasy was sometimes unavoidable. For example, the sea monster known as the Leviathan appeared in various forms on maps, inspired by biblical texts, but also sailors' tales of giant whales and strange sea creatures. Whether the cartographer truly believed in these beasts or simply wanted to warn sailors of danger is a question scholars debate endlessly. You can almost hear the mapmaker's internal voice as he pauses. Should I draw a serpent here? Will the reader understand this is a symbol of the unknown, or will they fear it as a real threat? And then there's the lovely paradox that the more maps attempted to be accurate, the more they revealed about the limits of human knowledge. The inclusion of dragons and wild men wasn't just superstition, but a visual acknowledgement of mystery, a humble nod to what we don't know. So, as your breathing slows and the map's edges blur, think of these medieval cartographers as your guides through not just the world, but the human mind. A blend of curiosity, faith, humor, and artistry. They remind us that maps are not just about places, but about the stories we tell to make sense of our journey. And now, gently, let yourself drift, carrying with you the soft scratch of quills, the glimmer of vibrant pigments, and the whispered secrets of those who charted the edge of the known world. As the gentle waves of your thoughts ripple on, you now find yourself exploring why medieval maps often put so much attention on the edges, those decorative margins filled with odd creatures, curious peoples, and fanciful scenes. These were not merely doodles to fill empty space, but served a vital role in the medieval imagination and map design. Think of the map margins as the medieval equivalent of today's loading screens or bonus features, places where artists could flex their creativity and inject a little whimsy or warning without distracting from the main event in the center. These borderlands were an invitation to dream, to ponder the mysteries beyond the known, and to marvel at the world's wonders and dangers. For centuries, the edges of maps became a showcase for monstrous races, strange beings believed to inhabit distant lands. You might remember the blemmy, headless men with faces on their chests, or the cyopods, creatures with one large foot they used as a sunshade. These were real citizens of the unknown, bridging geography and myth. These beings served multiple purposes. For one, they illustrated the idea that the world extended beyond human understanding. There were places where normal rules didn't apply. They also acted as a subtle caution. Travel too far, and you might encounter the strange or the dangerous. But why so many monsters? One practical answer lies in the medieval mindset, which valued symbolic storytelling. Dragons and monsters weren't just creatures. They were embodiments of chaos, temptation, or sin. Placing them on the map was a way to frame the known world as a safe, ordered space surrounded by wildness. Another quirky function of these margins was to provide a gentle humor or lightness, softening the sometimes serious or religious tones of the maps themselves. A little monster lurking near the bottom corner might have elicited a smile or chuckle from a medieval viewer, reminding them that even the edges of the world held a playful spirit. Some maps went further, including scenes of daily life or folklore in these margins, peasants farming, animals grazing, or even tiny illustrations of medieval punishments, always the gentler kind, like fines or public shaming. This made the map feel alive, a miniature world bustling with activity. Historians still argue about how seriously these monstrous races were taken. Did people believe these creatures literally existed? Or were they allegories, moral lessons, or even cartographers' inside jokes? The answer might be a little of all three. Interestingly, some monsters likely originated from travelers' misinterpretations of real animals. For example, early accounts of the platypus confused observers so much it was rumored to be a chimera. The armadillo might have inspired tales of a rolling armored beast. The sea monsters could be exaggerated whales or giant squid. Margins were also places where scribes and artists might sneak in commentary or subtle criticisms of political rivals, cloaked in symbolic imagery. A monster might represent a foreign enemy or a dangerous idea. And the artistic styles varied wildly, from delicate pen strokes to bold, colorful paint, reflecting the mapmaker's skill and the patron's budget. Some margins were lavish enough to rival illuminated manuscripts. One delightful example comes from the medieval Ebstorf map, a massive mappa mundi, where a giant Christ figure's body forms the entire world, and the edges are teeming with angels, demons, and mythical creatures. All this artistry meant that medieval maps were not just tools, but works of art, meant to be gazed at, pondered, and enjoyed much like a bedtime storybook, inviting you to imagine and relax. So as your mind floats along these margins, think of them as the gentle, creative spaces where the mapmaker's imagination meets the viewer's wonder. Small windows into a world where the unknown is both terrifying and charming, just waiting to lull you into restful dreams. Now that you're comfortably nestled in the soft glow of this medieval cartographic world, let's turn our attention to one of the most famous creatures to adorn these maps: dragons. They weren't just embellishments. Dragons were symbolic, mysterious, and sometimes downright practical additions to the edges of maps. Imagine, if you will, a mapmaker carefully sketching a vast ocean. As the known world ends, he adds a large dragon with curling tail and smoke rising from its nostrils, marking the boundary of human knowledge. The dragon served as a kind of warning sign. Here be dragons, a phrase that has captured imaginations ever since. Interestingly, the actual phrase appears only rarely on surviving maps, but the idea sticks. Dragons embodied the unknown. They represented the dangers lurking beyond the edges of exploration, the risks of venturing too far, and the chaos outside divine order. To medieval minds, the world was a carefully balanced place, and dragons reminded viewers that stepping beyond might mean facing wildness and disorder. You might wonder where these dragons came from. Some were inspired by classical myths, like the monstrous serpents in Greek tales, or the fearsome beasts slain by St. George. Others likely drew from travelers' descriptions of large reptiles or unfamiliar animals. Some scholars even suggest that the fear of dragons was connected to real threats like crocodiles or giant lizards in far-off lands. Historians still argue whether map dragons were primarily cautionary symbols, artistic flourishes, or a mix of both. Regardless, their depiction evolved over time, from serpentine monsters to winged, fire-breathing beasts with a mix of reptilian and bird-like features. One quirky fact is that not all dragons on maps were threatening. Some were oddly whimsical, even playful. A few appear curled around compass roses or perched atop mountain ranges, almost like gentle guardians rather than ferocious foes. Dragons also served a narrative function. They visually punctuated the story of the map, guiding viewers' eyes and reminding them of the world's mysteries. In this way, they were early forms of infographics, combining art and information. Another interesting angle is how dragons on maps reflected contemporary fears and hopes. For example, during times of plague or war, dragons might appear more menacing, symbolizing chaos and death. In more peaceful periods, they could be more decorative and less fearsome. The placement of dragons was strategic too. They often appeared near unknown seas or unexplored territories, regions that were literally blank spaces on the map, filled only by the imagination and tales of travelers. You might also notice that dragons were sometimes combined with other mythical creatures like sea serpents or griffins, forming a menagerie of monsters that decorated the edges of maps like a medieval bestiary. The idea of "here be dragons" became so iconic that it was later adopted in literature and pop culture, symbolizing the allure and danger of the unexplored. And while today dragons are beloved fantasy figures, back then they were reminders of the limits of human knowledge and the mysteries that lay just beyond the horizon. As you drift further, imagine those dragons guarding the edges of the known world. Majestic, mysterious, and forever a little out of reach, ready to inspire your dreams with tales of adventure and wonder. As you continue to drift through the gentle currents of medieval cartography, let's now consider the surprising influence of religion on those dragons and the mysterious creatures at map margins. In the Middle Ages, religion wasn't just a private matter. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life, and unsurprisingly, into the art of map-making. Most medieval maps weren't just geographical tools, they were spiritual landscapes. The world was viewed through a Christian lens, and maps often reflected biblical stories, holy sites, and moral lessons. The inclusion of dragons and other mythical beasts on these maps had a deeper, symbolic meaning beyond mere decoration. Dragons frequently represented evil, sin, or the devil itself, an embodiment of chaos that stood in stark contrast to the ordered Christian world. These creatures on the margins acted like a boundary between the realm of the faithful and the wilderness of sin and paganism. So, when you see a dragon curled near a far-off land, it might be reminding viewers of the spiritual dangers lurking in uncharted territory. At the same time, some maps integrated biblical references quite literally. Jerusalem often occupied the center of medieval maps, anchoring the world spiritually and geographically. Surrounding regions might be populated with monstrous races thought to be descendants of cursed peoples mentioned in Scripture. A fascinating tidbit is that some medieval maps featured not only dragons, but also angels and demons, reflecting the ongoing battle between good and evil. This cosmic drama was visually captured on the same parchment that showed rivers and mountains, reminding viewers that their journey through the world was also a spiritual one. Historians still debate how much these symbolic creatures were meant to be taken literally. Were dragons purely metaphorical, or did medieval people believe in their physical existence? The answer seems to vary by region and period, but it's clear these images carried complex layers of meaning. The influence of religion extended to how maps were commissioned and used. Many were created for monasteries or wealthy patrons who saw maps as tools for meditation or education, not just navigation. Interestingly, the artistic style of dragons often reflected theological ideas too. For example, dragons with multiple heads or serpent-like forms could symbolize the many-headed beast from the Book of Revelation, adding layers of apocalyptic meaning to the map's borders. This blending of geography, theology, and myth might seem strange today, but it was natural then. Maps were as much about understanding the moral and spiritual order of the world as the physical one. Imagine looking at one of these maps by candlelight, pondering not just where dragons lurked, but what they represented in the grand cosmic scheme. A reminder that the physical journey was tied to a spiritual one. In this way, medieval maps were immersive experiences, inviting you to consider your place not only in the world, but in the divine plan. As you settle deeper into this blend of art and faith, notice how the maps quietly encouraged viewers to respect boundaries, not just geographical but spiritual too, and to imagine what mysteries lay beyond with a mixture of awe and caution. That delicate balance between wonder and warning is part of what makes these ancient maps so endlessly fascinating and so soothing to explore as you wind down. Drifting gently onward, You now enter a chapter of medieval maps, less about the creatures themselves and more about the practical challenges that led to these fantastic additions in the margins, the limitations of medieval geography, and the quirks of map-making technology. Medieval mapmakers worked in an era before satellites, GPS, or even accurate compasses. Instead, they relied on travelers' tales, ancient texts, and religious doctrine to piece together a patchwork view of the world. Unsurprisingly, large parts of their maps were incomplete or wildly inaccurate by modern standards. These blank or uncertain areas were prime real estate for dragons, monsters, and margin illustrations. Think of these monstrous figures as medieval filler art, similar to the doodles you might find in the margins of a notebook when you don't know what else to write. But unlike random scribbles, these drawings serve to fill the voids left by ignorance and uncertainty, imaginative placeholders for the unknown. Mapmakers were also limited by the materials they used. Parchment was expensive, so every inch of space was precious. Rather than leave blank, boring gaps, artists decorated the margins, turning uncertainty into opportunity. A quirky detail is how some maps feature fanciful compass roses or zodiac symbols near the edges, helping viewers orient themselves while adding a mystical flair. These symbols were part science, part superstition, reminding users that navigation was as much an art as a skill. Historians still debate how much medieval mapmakers intended these margin illustrations to be educational versus entertaining. Were these monsters warnings, moral lessons, or simply creative fun? Another practical reason for margin decoration was to signify, "Here be uncertainty." By filling unknown spaces with dragons or sea monsters, mapmakers were visually communicating where their knowledge ended and imagination began. It was a humble admission of limits, wrapped in artistry. One fascinating example comes from the Carta Marina, a detailed 16th century map featuring dozens of sea monsters and bizarre creatures near Scandinavia and the Arctic. These illustrations reveal how the unknown northern seas were a canvas for myths and speculation. The process of creating maps was painstaking. Artists worked with limited reference materials and often copied earlier maps, perpetuating errors and legends. The fantastical margins were thus part of a larger tradition of storytelling and symbol making that connected map users with a shared cultural imagination. The maps weren't just tools for travelers, they were also status symbols and conversation pieces. Owning a richly illustrated map was a mark of education and sophistication. Imagining the medieval viewer tracing their finger over a map, pausing at the edge where a dragon curled around a distant island, you see how these details sparked curiosity and wonder, perfect for a night's gentle, drifting thoughts. So as you ease toward the close of this journey, remember that dragons and monsters were not just fantasy, but a way to cope with the limits of knowledge and technology, turning gaps in understanding into artful invitations to dream. As your mind softly floats toward the end of this winding voyage through medieval maps, let's pause to reflect on the lasting legacy of those dragons, the mysterious margins, and the human stories they represent. Medieval maps were, above all, deeply human artifacts, crafted in a time when curiosity about the world mingled with caution and imagination. Each dragon or strange beast at the edge of a map was a symbol of the unknown, a gentle warning, or even a playful flourish that turned an empty space into a canvas of wonder. By now, you've seen how these creatures weren't mere decorations, but a language in themselves, telling stories about fear, faith, exploration, and the boundaries of knowledge. They remind us that our ancestors were explorers in their own right, facing uncertainties with creativity and a touch of humor. Interestingly, the spirit of these dragons still thrives today. Modern maps and globes may lack mythical beasts, but our fascination with the unknown endures in science fiction, fantasy, and space exploration. The edges of our maps have just moved from oceans to the stars. Historians still debate the balance between myth and fact in medieval cartography. But there's no doubt these maps were more than tools. They were stories, artworks, and meditations on humanity's place in the cosmos. As you relax, picture the medieval mapmaker dipping a quill into ink, crafting those fearsome dragons and mysterious creatures, each line a blend of knowledge, imagination, and hope. You might even imagine yourself as a traveler of those times, tracing the map's margins by candlelight, wondering what lay beyond, feeling the thrill of the unknown that still calls to us today. So, let your thoughts drift gently over the seas, beyond dragons and margins, to the endless horizon of discovery and dreams. Now, as you let your eyelids grow heavier, remember that the maps we make, whether on parchment or in our minds, are always journeys, guiding us softly toward rest, wonder, and new beginnings. You're now settling into the quiet twilight of this journey, the gentle hum of history fading like a soft lullaby. The dragons and mysterious margins you've explored are like old friends, whispering stories, not of fear, but of curiosity and wonder. They remind you that even when the world seems vast and unknown, there is beauty in mystery and calm in the slow unfolding of discovery. As you breathe out, feel the weight of the day gently lifting, replaced by the soothing rhythm of distant waves and fluttering parchment. Let your mind soften, as if you're laying down a well-loved map to rest for the night. The stories of medieval maps are more than tales of distant lands. They're reflections of the human heart, its hopes and questions, painted with ink and imagination. And just like those ancient cartographers, you are a traveler navigating the unknown, finding peace in the journey itself. So, let your thoughts drift, soft and slow, like the calm sea at dawn, free from hurry or worry. Let the whispers of history fade into a gentle silence, inviting sleep to take you by the hand. Now, rest easy, knowing the dragons at the edges of the map are watching over you, guardians of dreams and the quiet magic of the night. Sweet dreams.